Hi everyone. My name is Carolin and I am from the University of Siegen, which is the former University of Tobias too. And maybe many of you know that he has a human resources background, and so do I, of course. And that's why you will probably think I'm going to put an HRM lens onto esports. But I'm going to turn that the other way around. I'm going to put an esports lens into human resources management. And more specifically, I want to talk about competencies, which do already exist in the ecosystem of esports, to be transferred into the ecosystem of human resources management. And for that, it is important for you to know as to which it is important, or of which there is a need that we integrate skills from the ecosystem of esports into human resources management. And this is mostly rooted within the numerous people issues which human resources management is traditionally responsible for. And for that you can get a proper view about some of these people issues, I brought some examples. And the first of it is diversity and inclusion. Human resources management needs to foster diversity and inclusion in organizations so that we can create an equitable working place. Then, human resources management needs to promote lifelong learning. They need to ensure that their employees are well trained not only for today, but also for the demands of tomorrow. Then, HRM is responsible for managing a multi-generational workforce. As many of you might know too, that now we do have a workforce which do exist through different age groups with different needs. So human resources management needs to ensure that all those needs are met. Then they need, of course, support mental health. We had that issue before too within esports players. They need to integrate policies, practices into the organization so that they can assure mental well-being. Then they need to manage remote and hybrid work. They need to ensure that the productivity of the organization stays the same when the people are working from at home, like many of you might know too, when they're working and when they are still working in the offices. Then we have another issue, which is called sustainability. Human resources management needs to integrate sustainability into the everyday practices of the talents. And then they need to manage technological change. They need to ensure that the employees in the organizations can handle technological change so that they can leverage the potentials of technologies in the future. And last, and I assure you this is certainly not least of the people issues, human resources management needs to manage the skilled labor shortage. They need to integrate strategic recruiting so that the workforce is also there for the future demands. So now that you got some field of the topics which human resources management is responsible for, you see that those are quite numerous. But the important thing with managing all those people issues is that they are not looked at in a silo mentality way. They need to be looked at in an interconnected way. And for that, human resources management needs to find creative solutions. But the problem with finding creative solutions, not only in human resources management, but mostly in all organizations, is the tiny little thing which is called best practices. So best practices are rooted in the past, but once we declare something as best, it sometimes becomes frozen in time. Normally, learning should be ongoing, but best practices say that maybe at that best practice, or at that practice, learning has reached a certain endpoint. And this can yield overconfidence in poor strategies, not which were poor strategies in the past, but maybe poor strategies to new issues. And that's why this can be dangerous for human resources management too. And for that you can understand that a bit more, I'll give you an example. As many of you might know, Tobias has founded a startup with which they want to integrate esports and gaming into talent recruiting and commitment in organizations. And this is by far no best practice. This is for human resources management a new solution. And this is why they are having sometimes a hard time to convincing human resources management of the opportunities which lying in incorporating esports and gaming into recruiting and commitment. And that's where I asked Tobias, what can change that? What's most challenging about that work that you're doing? And he said mostly human resources management can't grasp the opportunities of esports. And this lies in a phenomenon which is not HRM specific, definitely not, which is called cognitive laziness. This is more a human-centered problem. Cognitive laziness means that humans are mental misers. We prefer the ease of hanging on to old news instead of grappling something new. And this is mostly because this is comforting. This is comforting because we can rely on our existing knowledge. But the problem with that is that we need to declare that what was wrong, what was right in the future can be now wrong. And so you see the pivoting point to finding creative solutions for all those people issues is not only organizationally centered, but people-centered. And for my argumentation today, I say the pivoting point are the competencies of human resources managers in organizations to find creative solutions, like, for example, integrating esports into talent recruiting. And that's where my two research questions for today yield from. My first research question is, of course, which competence exactly do human resources managers need in organizations to find opportunities for creative solutions? And my second research question is then, of course, can human resources management find those competencies in the ecosystem of esports? And if so, where exactly? And this is what I'm going to do in the next 10 minutes with you. And for my first research question, we now need to dive into a theoretical background so that we really know what we're talking about, which competence we are searching for. And for that, I dived into a management theory which is called dynamic capabilities. For those of you who don't know dynamic capabilities, I brought a quote which reads, "Dynamic capabilities are a firm's ability to integrate, build, and reconfigure internal and external competencies to address rapidly changing environments." So basically, that means dynamic capabilities are the conditions for organizations to achieve competitive advantages in dynamic environments. And those dynamic capabilities are based on organizational micro-foundations. For example, organizational processes, skills, assets, or rules. And they enable the organization then to sense, seize, and reconfigure opportunities in the internal and external environment of the organization. So mostly those dynamic capabilities were researched to be physical organizational activities. And up to, I guess, 15 to 20 years later, after dynamic capabilities was introduced to management studies, Helfat and Peter Raff argued, no, they're not only organizational activities, they also reside significantly at the individual level in organization. And they called those dynamic capabilities dynamic managerial capabilities. And those dynamic managerial capabilities do have cognitive foundations, like, for example, perception to information, attention to information, and active problem-solving skills. And those cognitive foundations enable then the individual managers to sense, seize, and reconfigure the opportunities for the organization. And this, I argue, is exactly what we are looking for in human resources managers, to sense, seize, and reconfigure opportunities for creative solutions to all those people issues in organizations. And therefore, I searched for a competence with summarizes those cognitive functions or those cognitive foundations of managers and organizations. And there I found mental flexibility. I guess the psychologists of you already heard of mental flexibility. Which I read and which I recognized is that there are also synonyms for it, which is called cognitive flexibility or mental set shifting. And the definition of mental flexibility is the ability to adapt one's thinking and behavior in response to changing circumstances, demands, or new information. And I want to go back for that you understand, because of it, it's important for human resources managers is in Tobias' case. If the human resources managers would have developed or exploit the competence of mental flexibility, they could have adapted their thinking and behavior towards the new information which Tobias and his colleagues gave to the human resources managers. So they could have engaged with the opportunities which lie in incorporating esports and gaming into recruiting and commitment. So that's why my first proposition, based on my first research question for today, is that mental flexibility is the competence which we need for human resources managers to find opportunities for creative solutions. And now that we found that basis, we can now put the esports lens onto human resources management. And this is where it gets interesting for you guys, I guess. This is my second research question, which names, can human resources management find those competencies in your ecosystem? And second, if so, where? And for that, I had two conditions when I dived into the literature. The first one was mental flexibility already studied in your literature? And the second one was, are there positions and people in your ecosystem or in our ecosystem who are equally responsible for people issues like human resources managers are? And with that both conditions in mind, I concentrated on two positions. First of all, esports professional players, and of course, esports coaches, because they are responsible for player issues, if we want to put it in that way. And first of all, I am going to focus on esports professional players. Like many of you might know, there are already a lot of studies who argue that the skills which players acquire right now in the ecosystem of esports and during play are the skills we need for the modern working places. And for example, Scholz and Nothelfer argued that esports players do display the competencies which we need for the modern digital society of the future. And then I dived into their literature review and I saw and I filtered for some competencies which stand in connection to mental flexibility. For example, those were active learning, complex problem solving, creativity, critical thinking, and flexibility. And they are pretty much in connection to those dynamic capabilities and to mental flexibility I explained to you before. Because players are constantly, they must constantly adapt to dynamic environments. They must constantly adapt to the dynamic environment of the team, and they must constantly adapt to new updates or new patches to those games. And then second, I found that cognitive flexibility was already studied. And due to the fact that cognitive flexibility was used as mental flexibility too, as a synonym in the literature, I can now argue here that cognitive flexibility is already studied through players. Some of the researchers argue explicitly that League of Legends players especially do display cognitive flexibility because they are in a much more dynamic environment due to the updating through the patches, for example. But some other studies say it is not quite clear right now, so we need further research on that. But those were the competencies I found in relation to mental flexibility. And then I want to focus on esports coaches. When I dived into the literature on esports coaches, I did not find a direct link to mental flexibility, but I found two competencies which stand closely in connection to mental flexibility, which are, for example, paradoxical thinking. Paradoxical thinking is the ability to conceptualize opposite ideas as existing simultaneously and then acting on it. Which means that, for example, Chu et al. In 2022 researched the kind of paradox of performance and well-being in players. So coaches are responsible for encouraging performance and equally well-being in players. But sometimes performance comes at a cost of well-being, and sometimes well-being comes at a cost of performance. So coaches need to be able to know in which situation they need to foster performance and in which situation they need to foster well-being. So they need to be able to adapt their behavior and thinking to those specific moments. And this is what paradoxical thinking is about. And then I found meta-strategizing. I guess every one of you knows what a meta is. Due to the fact that those metas are dynamic constructs, coaches are constantly in a dynamic environment. They need to constantly adapt their thinking and behavior to those new patches and updates which get updated regularly, on a regular basis. So they need to not only adapt their own thinking and make tactics based on it, but they need to also adapt the players to those tactics, not only based on their weaknesses, but also on their strengths. So this can be called mental flexibility too. And based on this literature review, I came to my second proposition, which is mental flexibility can be found in the ecosystem of esports. And based on those two propositions, we now need to talk about the fact, what does that mean for human resources management? What does that mean for our people issues? And second of all, we need to talk about what can you and us guys learn from that, and what can we study more? What do we need to do? What can academic esports do with that knowledge? And first of all, I want to focus on human resource management and practice. So my first insight here is that esports should not only be incorporated into recruiting and commitment, but also into training and development for, in my case, human resources managers, because through that, they can adapt from time to time mental flexibility. And second of all, which is some fruit of thought here, is that esport coaches and players could serve as trainers in those training environments. And last but not least, and for me, this is the most important fact which I'm going to take as a takeaway from that, which is human resources management should focus on their target audience, which is employees, when they need to find creative solutions, just as coaches are doing that. Because when coaches do make new tactics based on new updates, they only can access those updates through the players. They need to adapt their strategies based on the strengths and weaknesses of their players. So their target audience is are always the players. And this is what human resources management should do too when they want to find creative solutions for people issues. Focus on the employees. And then, what can academic esports do with that insight? The first one is we should not only concentrate on general competencies, which can be transferred into modern workplaces, but more on specific skills or competencies, which can be transferred to specific fields, like, for example, human resources management in my case, or marketing, branding, logistics, sales, everything. So that, and that comes to my second point, we can study career paths for players and for coaches after their careers in esports. Because I noticed that here, and I knew that before, that the career perspectives for players after their career, which ends quite early in their lifetime, are not quite clear. And through articulating and being more specific about their further career paths, we can say, okay, you can find your positions in management and business too. And last but not least, and this is really a long shot, I would say, this is an idea that mental flexibility could be a substitute for game knowledge. I read about the fact that esports coaching is, compared to sports coaching, a kind of new job field. So the talent pipeline for being a coach is quite short. Because normally when you were a professional player, you get into being an esports coach. So maybe, and then I read about the problem, and I heard about it too, that esports coaches without a former career do have some problems with legitimacy. So maybe mental flexibility could be a competence which could be argued as being a prerequisite for having game knowledge. Because through knowing that my coaches do have mental flexibility, they can easily adapt their thinking and behavior to those dynamic gaming environments. So, like every other study, especially a conceptual one, mine has limitations too, and I divided them into my 2 research questions. And concerning my first research question, the first limitation is the terminological clarity of the construct of mental flexibility. I saw that mental flexibility is sometimes used as a synonym for cognitive flexibility and sometimes as a synonym for mental set shifting. But then there were other researchers who argue, okay, mental flexibility is equally to psychological flexibility. And this is not quite clear now. So before we can dive more deeply into mental flexibility, we need to be really clear about what mental flexibility is about. And second of all, I only focused on management studies for my theoretical grounding because my background is management. So this conceptual study needs more psychological grounding. And I hope that Fatma would be here because she is studying cognitive foundations of players, but maybe I can get some time with her tomorrow. And the second research question, I had the limitations that I only concentrated on 2 actors in the academic esports system, which means that there are quite a few other positions where you can say those people do also display mental flexibility. And then I only focused on 1 competence. There are certainly other competencies of esports coaches and esports players which we can need in human resources management to find creative solutions. And last but not least, this is all based on a thorough literature review, and therefore empirical testing for mental flexibility in the esports system is needed. And after that, I want to end with 1 point, which is what I learned from the past few weeks, making myself familiar with mental flexibility, which is I need that too, definitely. And this is why I would say this is not something that should be specifically to human resources managers or specifically to coaches or esports players. This should be something which is universally searched for. And my hope for academic esports is that academic esports could be the field where mental flexibility is researched thoroughly so that we can transfer that into other academic traditions and, of course, into our everyday lives. And with that, I thank you for your attention.